And speaking of the long shadows of history, in 1964, if I'm not mistaken, um, the United States Army, the Special Operations Research Office, planned a research program in Latin America, and you happen to have been against it, you happen to have opposed it, and you happen to have torpedoed it. And this is what I know. It was vetted with $6 million and was supposed to be a research project to last for 4 years. And that's 1964 to 1968, preceding Daniel Ellsberg's Pentagon Papers. Why did you oppose it? Why did you torpedo it? And what was it about?
Well, that was the Project Camelot, and the reason why it is mentioned in this editorial is that I'm asking rhetorically the question, can mindsets be mapped? Can you sort of look at the world and find out how mindsets, set minds, if you will, are distributed in space? And to some extent we can. If you are at home with civilizations, they provide you with maps and they are distributed in space. And they tell you something about how the minds are, if you will, shaped and formed by big forces. Now, Project Camelot was, in a sense, not very philosophical. It was simply an effort by means of public opinion studies, comparative public opinion studies all over the world, to try to find out how people all over thought about something called development. But what they were particularly interested in was not actually development, but it was revolutionary thinking. Where in the world, geographically and socially inside society, because these were public opinion studies with all the social variables in them, so you could get at it, did you find what you could call revolutionary thinking? And why were they interested in that? Well, when I was invited as a consultant to the project, because I lived in Latin America, I spoke Spanish, I could, in a sense, be helpful on the Latin American end of it. Somebody had slipped into the invitation to me a little slip of paper where it said, the real purpose of this project is to find out how the United States Army can help friendly armies. Aha. Revolutionary sentiment could be against friendly armies. Deeper understanding of all of this could make the US Army a very helpful party to the non-revolutionary sentiment that one would assume in general that the governments and their armies would be interested in. So, Nako, what happened was I was in a dilemma, and I'm not at all trying to make a sort of hero out of myself. I was the whistleblower. I became that one, but I was in doubt. I asked myself, could there be something that I haven't seen, something I haven't understood? Here you have the whole range of top people in US sociology who are participating in this project to analyze the data. So I contacted them, since I knew all of them, and they said, Johan, don't take it so seriously. Don't you see, for the first time, Washington is paying attention to sociologists. They have always paid attention to economics. Now they pay attention to us. In other words, there was self-promotion on the side of sociology in it. And it was quite clear that it didn't matter what the purpose of the project was. That worried me immensely. So I had some back and forth with some famous sociologists. And I myself had a short career, only, let us say, 7 years. I took my degree in sociology, the equivalent of a US PhD, in Oslo in 1957. And as you said, we are talking about 64, 65. I was invited to join it in 65. So after many qualms and ups and downs and back and forth, I decided that I will, to use your word, torpedo it. So the question is, how do you go about doing that? Well, you start blowing whistles. And the whistles I had blown in the US had fizzled out. They didn't help anything. There were no takers. They were just arguing against. To them, much more important was that sociology was taken seriously. And they should show Washington how clever they were. However, in Chile, where I was a UNESCO expert, the reaction was a very different one. Here, interestingly, those who had the so-called revolutionary sentiments, communists, they said, why don't we join the project, get the money, and give them fake data? I didn't like it. I found that highly immoral, and it, if you will, it squared very well with what my image of, well, rank and file communism was. I found heroes, very straightforward individuals very often, but also that kind of thought. So to cut the long story short, it was left-wing Christian democracy that helped me. And what I wanted more concretely was to get the documentation about the project on the table of the president of Chile, whose name right then was Eduardo Frei. He was in very difficult negotiations with the US government about the copper mines in northern Chile. There was talk about nationalization, and in the shadows of all that, there's also something more radical that could come up, Salvador Allende, who finally won, but that came much later. And his key advisor was a person who plays a certain role in this, whom I didn't know at the time, and Juan Garcés from Valencia, political scientist who was a consultant to Allende, and for him, my whistleblowing on Project Camelot was a great awakening. Now, he became the key advisor to Salvador Allende. And what was Salvador Allende, since we are talking about revolutionary sentiment? He wanted free luncheons for all Chilean school children with milk. To identify that pure communism is insane. I mention it because these are the kinds of things we are talking about, you see, in reality. Okay, it landed at the table of Eduardo Frei. Eduardo Frei was almost white with anger. He presented the papers to the US government in the negotiations, and he said, if you don't cancel this project immediately, Camelot, I cancel the negotiations. The day after, Lyndon Johnson came out in New York Times and canceled the project. Camelot was cancelled. And there was a mention of a Norwegian pacifist. Now, it was not pacifism. I have never been 100% pacifist as a kind of ethical commitment against any kind of violence. There are occasions when violence is the least evil. I also belong to that school. It's only that my criteria are very strict. But now, having said that, the point was, I think Norwegian pacifist was used in order to try to point to something sort of insignificant. Now, if I was that insignificant, it was clearly that the insignificant had played some role. The project was cancelled. Next time the project was relaunched the next year, and it goes without saying that I was not invited as a participant in that project. It was whistleblowing, Michael, and I had no predecessor. There was nobody I was imitating. I was sort of navigating these difficult waters myself. But I have told you something about it. I have not mentioned what played a certain role, that they had promised me an invitation to Arlington, Virginia, to discuss the details of the project. And they said that my modest honorarium would be, unfortunately, only $3,000. Well, it would be about $30,000 today. So I was having a sleepless night, and to be quite frank, I was weighing against each other $3,000 and being true to myself. Well, I come out with a second.
Which, if I understand correctly, is something you don't mention in this particular editorial, but this is something that you've done consistently throughout your career. There was a similar situation with Oxford University during the Vietnam War. Is that correct?
Not so much Oxford, it was Harvard,
It was
actually.
Harvard, all right.
But it happened to be Harvard. I was invited as a visiting professor to Harvard. And Harvard University played a considerable role in supplying information and all kinds of things, including actually, I think, in cooperation with MIT, although MIT was more on the technical side, software, hardware. I said, no, I'm not going to be visiting professor at the university that is not only supporting, but actively contributing to the Vietnam War. So you can say it's been a line, and I've been consistent. But if you look at the editorial, the point about it is a kind of summary of 20 experiences of things that, in my experience, play a considerable role. And here we are not talking about revolution, non-revolution. We're talking about peace. We're talking about a less violent world. We are talking about, as I point out in one of the 20 points, peace by peaceful means. It is not only to end up with a peaceful result, that the parties live together and handle their conflicts well, but that we have arrived at that in a peaceful way. So you see, the first conflict I mediated, which was in Charlottesville, Virginia, United States, 1958 to 60, over black-white, segregation, desegregation, schools. The point was not only to desegregate, but to avoid violence. There were two goals. And you can say in the slogan, the mantra, peace by peaceful means, there are two goals. And the editorial is then a list of 20 things that you should pay attention to if you are interested in it.
Absolutely. You've mentioned three things that I think would be very good for our audience to have them in this interview already. One of them is that you have very strict criteria for when violence is applicable or when violence is inevitable in your analytical system as a peace researcher. I think it would be good to hear it from you if you could just outline what that criteria is. A second thing you mentioned is democracy. One of the points among the 20 points, if you could spell out that a little bit. I know that you have a very some very important points about democracy theory, which I hope you'll mention in this interview. And the third thing is that you mentioned UNESCO, and I'll get to that after you answer. That's sort of my agenda.
You mentioned the point about violence. Well,
se rebatió una de las maracas en la